Happy New Year. In this video, I'd like to go over how to use Warp to host a static site. Let's get it. All right, so I'm gonna walk you through some of the steps I took to figure this out. It's pretty straightforward because of the documentation, but let's go through it anyway. So you go to Warp and you really want to get to their examples because their examples show you how to do this explicitly. And you can do that by clicking on repository and then going to examples. And in the examples, they have a README. And the README breaks it down into sections. So the section we care about today is serving HTML and other files. They have a couple examples here, well, a few. File.rs, serving static files, directory, a whole directory of files, and handlebars, which I believe we already went over in another video. So let's go to the directory first. And if you notice in this example, it is pretty short, as in they only really have warp serve, and then in here they have warp fs dir, which seemingly is file system directory, and then the path to the directory. Though this makes sense, it wasn't explicit enough for my taste, so then I ended up going to the documentation. So if you go to, here we go. If you go to the warp documentation and you search for a file system, let me take a step back. Actually, I could just do it here again. Search for file system, FS. It brings you to this page, which tells you that there are two things here. There's a directory and there is a file. So we go to the directory one. In here, they have a more explicit example of how to serve a directory. So down here in the example, we have warp path. They give you the path. They called it static because that's a common name used for static assets. And they did and then in the and they did warp file system dir, and then the path to the static directory, which makes sense. And then in the comment, you can see that if there was a static app.js, it would serve the app.js. And if there was a static CSS app.css file, it would also serve that as well. So typically when we're trying to serve a static site, we have our resources in a static directory, and everything in that static directory needs to be served as well so that our page has access to it. This example goes over that really well. Now we go back to the examples, and we go to the file example. What we see in the file example is that, let me make that a little bit bigger. We have a README, warp get, warp end, and warp file system file README. So we're serving the README file explicitly, which is not an HTML file. So it shouldn't be rendered, it should be downloaded. Understood. And then in here, sort of like the example that we just saw, they have the serving of a directory. We have warp path. They give it a path, called it examples, ex, and warp file system directory examples. Now, it should be noted that the examples in this directory are Rust files, so they shouldn't be rendered. They should also be downloaded. So down here, they create the routes. And you can see that this is sort of like a rubric where you can say, this is the file that you're going to be serving, and this is the assets that are needed for that file to be served. Like, that's one way you can think of it. So this README could be replaced with an HTML file, and these examples could be replaced with a static directory of assets like CSS and JavaScript. Anyway, let's run this real quick and see what it does. So when running this example, given that there is a logger involved, and if I want to see the logs as I hit the site and whatnot, I should run with rust log equals trace. So the logs can be traced out to screen. And then everything else is pretty typical. Cargo run example file. So let's go to the site. Localhost 3030. Oh, and the reason why I'm using a private browser is because my browser caches a lot of things, and it cached localhost 3030, and I was getting the wrong thing last time I was trying to do this video. Anyway, coming back to here, we see that we have a file that wants to be open. It is a markdown file, and it's going to open my text editor. So as you can see here, this is the README, which is what we should be receiving. This is what's being served. Okay, that's as expected. And then if we go to the examples files, so let's go example, and one we know explicitly exists is file.rs, because we're running that file right now. And we can open it, and we can see this is the source code to the file that we're running. Makes sense, pretty clear. One thing I would like to point out is, I guess because I come from Python, I had the expectation that if I just hit the example directory, I would get a list of all of the files and directories here with hyperlinks that I can click through to go to which one I wanted to, like for viewing purposes. That's not a thing. If you just go to /ex, you just get a blank page. I mean, it's being served, but nothing's being rendered, and it can't give you anything. So keep that in mind. That should be noted. So in terms of an actual example of us using this knowledge, I figured I'd show that as well because I'm trying to write a static site. So let me just go to where my static site is. All right, so this is the file I wrote, and it's almost identical to the file example that we saw in the warp documentation. I switched the order around, but that's about it. So we have the static items, which is just me rendering my static directory. So here's the path, and then here's the directory, path to the directory. And then for the rendering of the HTML page, it's identical with the exception of this is actually an HTML page that's being pointed at instead of a markdown file. And then, like I was saying earlier, the sort of pattern that you can use is the file that you want to render, the HTML file, and then the path to the directory of all of the assets needed for that file. And then you can just serve it. So let me run this real quick so you can see what it looks like. Cargarone would be fine for this. So if I go to localhost, we can see that everything has been rendered, and because of the color and sizing and stuff, you can tell that HTML is also being found. Sorry, not the HTML, the CSS, and everything in the static directory is also being found. One thing I would like to note is the path. So if we come back to the source code, so let me close this. So we come back to this file, right? If you note, my path is relative to the source file, the source/main rs file. For some reason, it seems as though that is needed. And if you're not paying attention to that, that can be real gotcha because your files will not be found and you'll be wondering why. So just know that your paths to everything that you are referencing should be with reference to the main.rs file if you're using a main.rs file to render it. And with that, I think we reached the end of the video. Like I said before, Happy New Year. Also, if you liked the video, hit like, subscribe, yada, yada, yada. Outside of that, till next time. Peace.